So there's lots of amazing new AI tech out there. This has the potential to significantly impact our patient care in a really positive way. But lots of questions, lots of chatter. Is data security an issue? Who's dealing with the governance? So, what are the key questions we need to ask of each AI provider?
Okay, we need to find out from the providers, how do they demonstrate that they're GDPR compliant? How do they anonymize the data that's used? What's the security measures that they have in place? And how do they handle data sharing and storage? Do they collect any?
Mhm.
Those are the key bits to know. And if people are answering in the affirmative fashion and can show you how they're doing all of this, so not just say we're doing it, but actually provide written evidence, which would be the bare minimum standard, you can be assured that they're actually doing this properly.
So you've decided on a tech provider and you've asked all the right questions and they've answered reassuringly. So we really want to implement this new tech into our consulting room. What kind of documentation do I need to ask of the AI provider?
When you're starting to work with a provider, before using the technology, you should
Mm.
ask to see their data protection impact assessment, a DPIA. You should have a data processing agreement with them, so a written document about how they're going to use your data and what they're going to do with it. And you should ideally ask to see their DCB 0129 clinical safety certification. So that demonstrates that they're aware that they're handling clinical data and that there are some safety issues that arise from that and that they're taking them seriously.
Brilliant. And that's all in your custom GPT, isn't it? So people can
All
access
in
that
them.
and they'll be able to get all of that information clearly and explained as well.
Yes, and you can even have a chat with it if you wish, and it can talk you through what all of these mean and does the technology you're using currently have these standards applied to them as well? So it's a really useful resource for what is quite a complicated topic.
Hi everyone, we're back after a longer summer holiday, and we've got a really special guest, Dave Triska. I'm Amar Ahmed, Winslow Health Centre.
Fari Ahmed, also from Winslow Health Centre.
Dave,
Hi, nice to see you again. Hope you had a good summer.
absolutely. What did you get up to anything?
I had a long sabbatical, which was lovely, having been at my practice 10 years now. So
Wow,
back at the grindstone now.
absolutely, absolutely. Good. I'm glad you got a good rest. So what we're on about today is really, really hot topic actually. One of the commonest things that we get asked about when we're showing people all the latest tech, all the latest AI stuff, is are we allowed to use it? What do we have to do to use this? And quite rightly, people are worried about data security. Most people are. I mean, some people haven't got a clue, and they're just sleepwalking into quite a few traps. But that's what we're here for today, to answer questions. Well, hopefully for Dave to answer some questions about how we can use this tech safely and securely for patients' benefit and for clinicians' benefit.
Yeah, and actually, we should have said this before, but congratulations, Dave. I believe you have a new post at the
Indeed, yes.
forefront.
Thanks for mentioning. So I'm, as well as being a GP partner now, I'm doing some consultancy work, and I'm working with Toolsys, who's the AI transcription service provider. So giving a GP perspective on using this technology.
Brilliant, really important
Yeah,
to give the primary care opinion
point
on
of
that.
view. And it's
Absolutely.
great. So it makes sure that this conversation is well informed as well.
Definitely, definitely. So let's push on. We're talking about AI tools and large language model tools. What are we talking about here? Practical terms.
So, so large language models are sort of reasoning and verbal platforms in computers with lots of knowledge, and they can be deployed in various different ways. Most people are familiar with the sort of chat version, where Chat GPT is one, Claude's another, and you've got a variety of different ones that are being developed, including some open source ones. But in essence, it's a service where you can talk to it, and you can input data into it. And because they're getting cleverer and cleverer, they can do things with this now. So it can transform it into different modes, it can interpret things. So this raises a number of questions about data security, which is, first of all, where's the data going? What are people doing with it? And how is it being protected? And in healthcare specifically, people may be aware that we have a very special set of data because it's health data, so sensitive data, which is covered by specific regulations. And we need to make sure that where it's going and what's being done with it is both secure and that it's being processed correctly, and also that we know how to assure that. And I think that's the most difficult thing for people because it is a complicated area. And I've said to lots of people that this particular area, AI, large language models, is a bit like the Wild West at the moment. There's lots of companies out there, lots and lots of companies offering a variety of different solutions. Everyone's saying that everything's okay and that don't worry, it'll all be fine. But I think the most important thing is that people know how to make sure that what they're saying is true and what standards they need to apply.
So what can possibly go wrong? I'm using it in my consultation, and the patients come in, and I haven't even given any patient-specific information. The computer can't recognize who that patient is, and all it's doing is transcribing, but also making a summary for my notes. So what's wrong with that? What are the traps there?
So there's a couple of things that we need to be aware of. The main regulation that applies to this is the Data Protection Act, which is the UK's interpretation of GDPR.
Yep.
So this is about, is data being processed appropriately? So this includes what you're doing. Are there identifiable bits to it? And there's various principles that are applied. So in essence, if we're in a nutshell, we should use as little data as anonymized as possible in purposes for which they're essential with the consent of the data owner, which is GP surgeries, but also the patients themselves in our context. So, for example, if we were to start processing their data without their consent, that might cause significant problems. And you also fall foul of other potential pitfalls, which is once it is being processed, where is it being processed? So physically where in the world it is makes a difference. So in the UK, in essence, it's got to be in the UK. So most of these technologies need to have UK-based servers. And also what happens to it afterwards? Is it being stored? Is it being used for other things? So, in an extreme example, is it being sold to someone else by the third-party provider? Is it being used to train things? Because actually a patient might be quite happy that you use something to help you write their notes. What they may not be happy with is, even if it's somewhat anonymized, it's being used to train a model for one of these companies that they then profit off, because that's not what they understood from what you were doing with the technology.
Okay. So you've mentioned patient consent there, which is quite important. So is that what you're starting off with straight away with every patient consultation?
So it's important to gain consent for these, I think, just on a trust basis.
Yeah.
It starts to get a bit more complicated about whether or not that's absolutely critical, but I think it's good practice to do so for sure. And you're certainly never going to run foul of any potential complaints or regulatory breaches if you do gain consent from people. I normally say to people that I'm using a transcription service, which means that it will be taking the consultation as we speak. It won't be stored anywhere. There isn't any identifiable data that's kept anywhere else, and it will all be removed from external services as soon as I've finished with it. And all that will happen is that it's going to go into their notes as written information. And actually, people are happy with that. The explaining of this is quite important, because if you have to really tell people what's happening, and there's a number of resources that practices can use. I mean, actually, I did prepare a whole bunch of written resources for patients. None of them asked for it. So I think I've done 2,500 consultations now with this.
Wow.
Not a single person has wanted any of the written information I prepared for them, even though it's been offered. So our understanding of what patients think about this sort of technology is probably not in keeping with their actual acceptance of it, because it's common now. But good practice is to make sure that people know what you're doing with their data and what the purpose of that processing is.
Okay.
Yeah, I suppose some of that might even be put it on your waiting room screen, put it on your website, just so people are aware of it.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did just that with our website, our Facebook site, posters that are available to say that this is the service that we're using. If you don't want that to be used, please tell the clinician, etc. I mean, we're still in the early days of all this, and in a few years, this is probably going to become absolutely standard practice. Much like we don't say to people, "Do you mind if I record your notes on a computer?" because that's just normal now.
Yeah.
They just accept it, and it's an implied consent that I think in the future that's what's going to happen with this. But it's sensible, particularly for people starting out, to get that assurance that they're doing the right thing.
So you've got patient consent. Do we have to inform the MDU or MPS or anyone like that? Is that
so? There's no formal guidance to do so. In the sense, this is really regulated by. Although I'll come on to some potential pitfalls, there are the way that we're talking about it being used, which is essentially to transcribe notes. That's perfectly reasonable. And really the regulations that it comes under are about the use of data. So less so about the medico legal side of things. Later on in the conversation, I hope we can touch on medical devices.
absolutely, yeah.
And what that means.
Glass health. Yep.
Yeah, because if these large language models are not just used to transcribe things as one example, which is considered very low risk, there's sort of standards about what medical devices are and the grade of the risk with them. If they're starting to make decisions or give advice, that's a completely different matter, and I hope we can cover that a bit later.
Absolutely, definitely. Okay, and you were going to ask about your trainees, weren't you?
Yes, but before we go, just asking permission. Do you need to get permission from your ICB, or do you need to ask for forgiveness?
To do so. So this is a couple of factors in this. One of which is, can you physically get it on your computer? So if you're using the software, because obviously most places it's not actually our own services that we're using the ICB computers and networks. There's network security. And part of the stuff that we're going to talk about is how do you assure that these services are actually secure, but in essence it would be sensible to run past your data protection officer at the ICB with the service that you're planning to use. Hopefully you'll have some of the answers that we've got from what I'm going to advise you to ask, and secondly to correspond with the CSU, the computer support units. Might not be the right acronym, but the tech guys at the ICB who can advise you about if it's safe to install, because they'll want to examine if there's any installable software, for example, or even web-based services. Is it okay to use? On the most part, if the questions we're going to ask have all been answered in the positive, there shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, brilliant. Just like on the side of it, I know places like Great Ormond Street are using some of this. So do we need to go through all these steps?
If it's already been used by great institutions like Great Ormond Street, should we not just trust it?
So I think this is a principle on using any type of technology in healthcare, which is if it's new to you, these are the questions that should be asked. Don't make assumptions that because someone else is using it, that it is actually okay. So I can think of a few examples, which I won't name, that are being used at large institutions which have significant data protection issues with them, because some of the diligence that we're going to talk about hasn't been done correctly. This is complicated. It's complicated to understand. And, one of the things that generated our discussion today and the post that I wrote about how to check these things was because I was seeing lots of traffic from GPs about how do we use these? Oh, this is fine to do this. This is fine to do that. And realizing that people were blindly wandering into areas of risk for themselves because it's just a complicated set of regulations.
And worst case scenario, with GPs being the data controllers, what could go wrong?
The worst case scenario is having fines under the Data Protection Act, potentially going into criminality, although that's less likely, but significant fines that can run into the millions depending on the size of the business.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So it's really important that we address all this.
Yeah, it's an area of risk. It's because of the nature of the data in particular that we process, which is sensitive health data.
Fine. Okay, so let's press on then. So we've got a product that we want to use. We've done all the things that we've talked about so far. We're going to update the website. We're going to ask permission from patients. We've informed the ICB, the data protection person. What do we need to get from the actual product that we've chosen, from the providers of the product?
Yeah. So this is where we need to ask questions. So I think most of these suppliers, if you ask them a basic question and said, do you comply with data protection, you're not going to find anyone who says no, we don't. That just won't happen. But there are some specific questions that need to be asked. So I've put it in a post, which we're going to link to the show.
I should put a link down below.
Yeah, but essentially what we need to know is, do they comply with GDPR regulation? What's the security measures that they have internally? How do they collect the data? What do they do with it? Do they store it? Does it get used for anything else? And what are their safety measures that they put in place for them? So how do they cope if there's a breach of data? Have they done security checks on their own network so that we don't have an accidental leak, which wouldn't be our fault, but you can imagine where that would come back to. But I think the main point, if I was summarizing, would be that there are actually certifications for most of these areas, and it's about asking to see that certification, not just taking it on word. You'll notice on lots of websites for health tech companies that they say complies with, and then will list a particular specification. For most of the things that I've seen spoken of like that, there are actually certifications which you can apply for as a company. And that gives you the gold standard that, yeah, they are definitely complying with the regulations of both GDPR, data protection impact assessment, and the health regulations related to this sort of work.
So what kind of certifications are we talking about that include all of that?
So the main one is called DCB 0129, which is a manufacturer's regulation via NHS England about basically tech in health, and is it all appropriately set up, secure, data protected, etc. There are some more geeky things to ask about, but before we get onto those, the other main one is going to be about data protection and GDPR, and again there are certifications for this. So in the linked post and on the GPT, which we're going to talk about in a bit, then it will help you pull out these questions and the specific certifications that you can ask for and should be seeing, really. So most of the people who are serious about data protection in health tech will be falling over to give you these and should have them already pre-prepared. And certainly if you're talking to companies and they don't know what you're referencing, I would stop and pause for thought at that point and be contacting your DPO.
That's certainly been the case in one or two occasions when I've asked, so it's quite worrying, really.
And likewise for me, I've referenced some of these two tech companies that I've been inquiring about their products, and they've not actually realised that these were standards that they had to apply to. And I think it's worth mentioning to people that the reason I've said about the Wild West is because now that these very, very powerful large language models are readily available, there's a bit of a gold rush where in essence people are sticking on a front end to it and making a company, but actually there's a lot more to it in terms of the security that needs to happen for health data.
So and it's really helpful looking at your post, because it's almost like a simpleton's guide to questions you should ask. It would be helpful to know what answer you should be happy with, because if it says, how can you explain the AI's decision-making process, I would be lost.
I think a lot of the tech companies would be lost because I don't think they know either, do they?
Well, I think that's rather the point. So if you don't know how it's doing what it's doing, there's a big problem. Now, we're talking, what prompted this was very specific instances of things like transcription services. So, for example, they should be able to say, we get this thing in, this is what we do to the data that we get, how we scrub it and clean it and remove identifiable things. Then it goes into this thing. This is how we've made sure that's safe and it doesn't do anything crazy. And then this is how it comes out. So there's a little bit of a black box in general for large language models, because the internal workings of them are extraordinarily complicated, and it's difficult to say specifically what happens for anyone, including the companies that own them. But they should be able to, if you ask that question, what you shouldn't get is a big pause and what do you mean? There should be an answer of some kind. That's the point. So if that's not something that they've thought about, again, I would be pausing for breath there and just double checking all of these standards specifically.
Okay, really helpful to know. I guess you could always, if they're amenable, you could bounce it to your ICB people and say, does it sound sensible?
Sure. I mean, for lots of people, this is something that a data protection officer will help with.
Should be able
So
to.
every ICB should have a nominated data protection officer.
Yeah.
This is kind of their bread and butter. So the reason why I put this together is because although this is bread and butter for people who are data nerds, then
Yeah.
for most people, they've never heard of any of these standards, or
Absolutely.
most of these standards, I should say.
Yeah.
So if you're approaching companies independently, which is again the reason why we're talking today, or making your own things with ChatGPT, then if you don't know about all of this, you can get hoodwinked really quickly, and you can find yourself unwittingly being reassured by someone who's no better at data protection than you are.
And these firms, they don't have to be, because in a lot of other areas where we've got people supplying services to the NHS, they have to, get accreditation to supply the NHS, but we're not seeing that in this domain, are we?
We're not at the point where this is further along. The regulation from NHS England currently, it isn't really there for this. It's very early days. I think everyone's expecting in the next couple of years that's what's going to happen, and it will be interesting for the companies that aren't compliant what will happen at that point, and their users. But I think that's why it's even more important to do due diligence now. So there's not like an NHS England list of AI or companies, for example.
So Dave, we've got massive fines if it goes wrong, massive implications on data breaches and security. Why not just wait until NHS brings out some guidance?
These are enormously powerful tools, and they can make an immediate difference today for clinicians, administrators. They're enormously helpful. And actually, if people, it's more about realizing that this is a problem. I know I've gone into detail on my guidance notes about what the things we should be doing are, but again, if it's daunting, a data protection officer can help with that. But I would say that just knowing that this is a thing, it is really important for most people. And I think there are a bunch of folks who would be trapped into not getting the benefits of them, as you say, until it's very much more widespread and introduced. Which would be a shame, because actually, as you know, the profession's in real trouble at the moment.
We need this tech now, don't we? We actually need it in our consulting rooms right now. Okay.
I was just going to say, but I think Dave alluded to it. It's about how much of a risk practices are willing to take. I think we know that there's some practices who see a problem and look for solutions, and there's some who see a problem and wait for other people to generate solutions that they can use. So where are you on that spectrum?
So I think, so the regulation's there at the moment in terms of what standards people should be complying with, that this isn't a risk. In terms of like the medical device categories, for example, most of them would be considered, well, if they were operating properly, low risk. No different to kind of things that I guess things like Docman do and various bits and pieces like that, where it's auto detecting words, that sort of thing. So they're actually pretty unrisky, and if regulated properly, but it's having the knowledge to know that the company that you're interacting with is actually kosher and does everything properly and that's the bit that's missing, I think, for a lot of people at the moment. It just is a an opaque area that they're not aware of the regs for.
So we've spoken about what questions you need to ask these tech firms. So what documentation, you've mentioned a few, what documentation would you expect to see from a provider before you
so normally
implement
I'd
this?
expect to see a data protection impact assessment. So that's essentially, what are we doing with this stuff, what could go wrong. That's something that users should also have in place. A DPO would normally be able to help with that if you feel uncomfortable doing it yourself. A data processing agreement from them. So if you're interacting with these companies and they're taking data from you, there should be a written agreement about that, because you need some reassurance as a user and the data controller about what they're planning to do. So if you're using something now that you haven't signed a DPA for, I would pause, because that's something where essentially you've not made any formal agreements with that company. There's some certification about use of this sort of technology in health. That's DCB 0129. So it's not very, doesn't trip off the tongue, but that's the supplier version of it. But in essence, there should be some certification around that. And then there's a number of cyber security standards. Cyber Essentials Plus is one where it's sort of an externally validated. How safe is your network and your actual infrastructure? So, for example, can hackers break in and steal all this stuff from you if you're the supplier? So it's listed in that document. The GPT will help you provide that as well. But basically, there's a bunch of certifications, mainly data protection impact assessments, data processing agreement, and the DCB certification that they should be able to provide for you on request.
And you were going to talk to us about your GPT.
Yeah. I've tried to make this a bit easier because I appreciate that even the most engaged viewer might be looking, going, "Oh, that's a bit of an issue." So, in the same sort of spirit of the Accurix one that I did earlier on in the year, I'm releasing it for free, so it has to be on. You have to be on the Plus subscription to ChatGPT. Let me just get the window up for you so we can have a little look. So what I've done in the background of this is fed in all of the documentation regulation that you need. So I've got a number of sort of set questions here. So one of the things is, what questions should I ask an AI company? So again, this will help you go through those things that we've just talked about now, and it will generate answers for you in terms of what you need to be asking them, what the various different things are. It will generate emails for you, and specifically those certifications that we talked about. So you don't have to remember it all. The back end of this is trained for it, and you can actually just go into here, and you can also have a discussion about what these things are. So more importantly, when they come back to you, if you got that email back to you and you fed into it what they'd said, it will talk you through. Is it safe or not? Is this compliant or not? Is there anything else you should be doing? And there's some really good background knowledge to all of this. So the clinical safety bit, the DCB 0129, can you do a clinical safety report, for example, with it? How do you manage those safety risks? Who's your clinical safety officer? And I think for lots of people, we just wouldn't know to ask those questions. You can also ask it to review a certain company. So if you typed in the website, so I won't put a supplier in now. Let's just pretend that we were doing it. It will review the website for you. So, and it's also got things that you can start to look at for if you want to produce emails for them. So I've turned off the screen sharing because it's not the most engaging GPT in the world. It's fairly dry, as data protection generally is. But it is available. So all the stuff we're talking about, if you go away from this conversation and you can't actually remember any of it, it will talk you through it. If you want to ask about any specifics, so if you want to talk about what's GDPR, how do I apply that to my practice, what should I be doing in terms of our own policies, it will write them for you and do it for you and explain all these standards to you. So it's a one-stop shop for all things data protection. I should put with a heavy caveat that you're the data controller, so you need to be assured that the things that you're signing and writing and doing are accurate, and if you're in doubt, you should speak to your ICB data protection officer.
That's brilliant. That's really great, because I'd be thinking, wow, how do I even ask those? And that does it all for you.
It's really accessible. I mean, your GPTs are brilliant. They've revolutionized our practice admin side. So that's really, really helpful. So we'll be putting the links to your article, your checklist down below, as well as the GPT. You have to have a ChatGPT Plus subscription to access it, but otherwise it's completely free of charge. We're very grateful.
Thank you.
Where do you think? Just finally.
Wait, one more thing. Please put it up. The medical device.
That's what I was going to ask.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to nicely, but you ruined it.
Hey, I'm your missus. I'm allowed to do that.
Well, I was about to ask, where do you see we're going to be in about a year's time from now, or 5 years from time? Where's all this heading?
Okay, so I think all of these will be in widespread use in the low risk categories. I think that would be almost standard practice now. We'll probably look on it as we do now with SMS.
Yeah.
And think, how did we ever do it without it?
Yeah.
I think that's just the way it will be. I think it would be much more tightly regulated, and providers will have to be compliant with all the things that we've been talking about. I think some of the difficulties will be around some of the, I would say, unicorn uses of these technologies. So